Hello, Essa, and we're
Hello.
gonna we're gonna jump straight into it. Where did you grow up, and how did you get into writing?
So I grew up in Tauranga Moana. I was brought up by my nan. I spent a lot of time on the beach. It's like a lot of my like younger memories. Were at Mount Maunganui Beach. How did I get into writing? I don't know. I always think about like, school curriculum stuff. Like you're required you're required to do writing in like primary school. And I guess it's an important first step is that someone encourages you to do it. And my nan always like read me books when I was young. I remember her reading me The Hobbit and an amount of Lord of the Rings. Didn't read all of it. I think as soon as I started like playing under the table or whatever, she would kind of stop reading the book. So it was like a lot of like reading was just kind of a felt like a natural thing to be doing in the household I grew up in. And so um it'd be like, oh, you can, I've been given the gift of writing by the education system. Um and so I can make my own stories. And so I'd say like a pretty young age I was like interested in writing. So poetry I think came a lot later. Um Mostly with my like when I started getting into music, I got into music quite late because we were in a household that listened to music. And so I was like, I think I was 14 and I heard a Dashboard Confessional song on the radio. And I was like, holy crap, emotions.
I'm pretty
I
sure
think,
that guy's still recording stuff, eh?
yeah, I don't think he's gonna stop anytime soon. It was like, what was it? It was Vindicated, which was the song that they wrote for
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man 2, I think, or Spider-Man, one of them.
Yeah,
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 which is kind of
you're right on.
funny
Yeah.
that, you know, it's weird looking at things like that when you're thinking about um like what is nostalgic for you and then like what corporations generated the material for you to get nostalgic about something. um so I guess thanks Marvel in a way. Anyway. Anyway.
Wait, one thing you said earlier was like you talked about writing as a gift. Do you think when you were a child, sorry, when you were younger, did you actually think of it like that? Like it was a magical kind of thing that you'd acquired? Or is that more in retrospect?
Well, I think it was something. I remember, I don't know, I remember there being a bit of a struggle, especially having to, because part of like the writing stuff was you had to rule straight lines and I found that really difficult. I remember that being hard. um
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, you have like the sponge brain as a kid, so things go in a bit easier. And I, had set up to learn that through reading a lot. And yeah, I don't know.
I think
Oop.
for me as well, actually, music was really important, or like lyric writing or songwriting. I think it
Mm,
was for me the Smashing Pumpkins
right.
um that did it. Of course, like was also into a lot of um uh the Green Day and My Chemical Romance as well. But
Yeah.
I think, it looking back, it is amazing to me how that detour occurred. So apart from music, like when did you actually start reading poetry per se?
Hmm. Um, it would have been in high school, so not long after I got into music, I would say. Um, because I enjoyed reading like the lyric booklets that came with
Yes.
um albums, almost like detached from the music itself, and like the kind of rhythms that it would create without the, like the music being there. Um, I don't know. I can't remember an exact time because I think we had to read like poetry for
That's right.
English. So we had like
Because did you like
ling
English? Because I feel like maybe until the very end of high school, I did not.
I mm, there were things about English that I absolutely despise, like debates and speeches and those things. And I think it also depended on the texts you were looking at as well, like how interesting they were to you as a teenager. But I thought it was all right, I think. I don't know. I remember, yeah, actually, I remember really liking sonnets when I was in year nine because we had to like one of the assignments we had to do was write a Shakespearean sonnet, essentially, um, that was about nature. And I remember enjoying that a lot. Um, I definitely didn't get the iambic pentameter down, but I got the rhyme scheme and stuff. So
I
I
think
think,
there's definitely something
yeah.
comforting, right, about those like closed forms.
Mm,
Um, it makes you feel safe when you're like plugging in the syllables.
yeah, just slotting in like what words. That's why a lot of them are atrocious because they've just slotted in what would fit and not like what creates like the most resonance or whatever. Which I don't know. Which is why I don't really write in those forms because it's too hard to write a good poem for me at
It
least.
is, and but I think, one thing that transcends one idea that transcends the closed form is the idea that constraints can be very useful, right? And I
Mm,
think we're definitely going to get into that later.
yeah,
So okay, in high school, I'm imagining so you're doing writing like alongside school for yourself already?
yeah. So I was very into like fantasy books,
Yeah.
and I had like well, I've since like given to like a secondhand bookstore, but I had like 66 Star Wars novels
Wow.
that I had accrued across my like childhood and teenage years. Um, and those were like what I read a lot of when I was like getting into reading properly. Um, yeah, and then like Lord of the Rings and
Yeah.
um I remember my nan pitching Lord of the Rings to me. She was like, it's like old-fashioned Star Wars, is what she said to me. I was like, oh. Um, Yeah, and so I wrote like I don't know, I liked world building things and drawing maps and writing.
Was it like fanfic? Like were you kind of supplementing one of these
Um,
these fictional worlds, or were you building your own already?
so for assignments at like intermediate or like early high school, it would be like fan fiction. I remember writing uh Aragon fan fiction,
Hmm.
the Christopher
Yeah.
Paolini.
Hmm.
Yeah. But if it was my own time, it was like, my own characters and story. Unless I was doing like some weird Greek mythology thing. Oh,
We're going to return to
yeah.
this.
Yeah. Foreshadowing.
Okay. Okay. Um, that's amazing. I always admired, I think, the people around me when I was that age who were, consistently writing. Like I was producing stuff on the side of school when I was, yeah, 16, 17, but it was late in that sense, and it was still quite scattered at that point. Um, so after high school, did you know that this was something that you were going to continue doing? Or was that something that you already aimed to be doing at that point?
So my first year of uni, which was like the year after, like I went straight from high school to university, I didn't write at all.
Mhm.
Um, there was a person who told me that I should stop writing dark things, and so I just stopped writing altogether.
Was that on MSN Messenger?
No, no, I didn't have the internet till I was at university. So
Wow. Okay. Okay.
yeah, I had the internetless childhood, which I'm actually kind of thankful for, seeing how it is now. But you know,
Well, I'll say this, that in terms of dark things on MSN Messenger, people would just change their names all the time. And my name every day
yeah,
used to be like a different, really dark, edgy line from the Pumpkins.
yeah,
And my mates would message me being like, "Why are you so emo, man?" Like, um, that's amazing that you didn't get the
it's
internet
good.
until university.
Yeah, but yeah, my nan just didn't. She still doesn't have the internet. She just was like, "What's the point of it?" And I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. All right. Well, can you take me fast forward to you starting to, I don't know, produce, compose some of the work that would eventually end up in Ransack? And then we can start talking about Ransack. Because, okay, one bit of signposting that I will do here is a lot of poetry books tend to be collections of individual poems.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is that the individual poems are kind of meant to be autonomous, largely stand for themselves or by themselves, and their relationship to the other poems in the collection are like not that they don't exist, not that those relationships don't exist, but that they are less of a priority. Whereas when I read your, your two published books, I definitely get the sense that the whole is meant to exceed the sum of its parts, so to speak. Would you agree with
mm.
that?
I definitely try to do
Yeah.
that. Yeah, there's like many collections I've scrapped, which are basically the other thing, right? Like the what I think are my best poems put in one place. And I just don't feel very excited by that. Um, so I don't know. I feel like I should make an archive or something because like I keep clicking on links to things I had published ages ago and they go to nowhere, which is a bit sad. Um, but yeah, Ransack was basically because it was written for the Masters in Creative Writing at the
Mm,
Institute of International Institute of Modern Letters at Vic in Wellington. It was kind of had to be all written within that time period.
mhm,
I had written there's one collection I never did anything with that I had written for another creative writing course for Tracy Slaughter at the Waikato University. I think it was like for it was like my dissertation, I think. Um, and that was like a kind of I don't know precursor to what Ransack ended up being, in that it like has multiple threads that run through and like there's no partitioning really, it's just kind of all threaded.
yeah.
And so I really liked that aspect of that collection. But I didn't end up doing anything with it because it was just way too personal and weird. And so Ransack, um, I didn't really start writing it till later in the year. Um, it's like this thing where you complete one folio, which is like a short, like maybe like 20 pages of work to show the workshop, and then later on you do a longer one, and then you end up. I think the third submission is basically what you're going to. It's like the end product.
Yeah.
But my thing was different every time.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm,
so like hardly anyone in my workshop saw what Ransack was essentially. I started off with this like weird, kind of like a script, I guess. It wasn't like it was just kind of like poetry formatted like a script. It didn't have all the kind of like conventions of a script, but it was yeah, it's like this weird form that I was experimenting with that was like about a spaceship that crash landed on a planet. I think it was like Earth of the future, and it was just like kind of animals and like old creatures still around and no humans, and they're kind of like journeys through the wreckage of the world. And I didn't get very good reception to that. It was just kind of like what is this? Especially since I wasn't writing it. Like what I've said was probably a clearer version in many ways than the actual thing I wrote. Like it was quite dense and not very representational, I guess. It was just kind of like here's some language play that is
mm,
technically telling the story, but
I see.
I don't know if
It's like
anyone
fairly
else would think that.
opaque, a lot of like surface play. Not
Mm,
surface play,
mm.
but material play, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
I think this is a touching on something that I wanted to bring up, which is that in writing, often you experience a lot of false starts, so to speak.
Mm,
Um, you start writing manuscripts of books that don't really go anywhere, or you at least have the idea for multiple books and they don't go anywhere, or you start writing like sequences of poems that don't quite go anywhere. But I imagine that, well, maybe this is a question for you. How much of that stuff did you look over when you were putting Ransack together for the hand-in, and how much of it could you reuse? Did you reuse any of it? You mentioned there was like a proto Ransack already as well.
yeah. So the book that I wrote before that never got published was only similar to Ransack in that it threaded things together. There was no
I
reused work
see.
from that.
It was a
Um,
structural kind of,
yeah, it was
I
just like
see.
that's kind of what I want a book I write to be. Um,
Amazing. Okay. Mhm.
um, and then the second kind of draft thing, which was different from the sci-fi thing, was had a name. I must have stumbled in was what it was what it was called, and it
Mhm.
was very. I think it covered same kind of like searching and wondering about gender stuff that Ransack
Mhm.
does, but I'm not sure how much overlap in the actual poems there was. Um, and then um, yeah, and then I wrote a manuscript called that I never showed anyone that year called formerly known as something that could fit in a box. Um, and that was kind of like me tracing what was what I saw as the start of my transition journey in 2017, though it didn't actually, like in terms of medical transition, it didn't go anywhere until like very recent, really. Um,
That's an amazing title, as well. Just like it's very meta because, we're in many ways just in terms of the book, making a book, we're already talking about the relationship between one and many, right? One
mm,
as the totality, so to speak, and then many being the parts, and how the tensions that exist between those two levels, and like how how those parts are coherent or cohesive at all. And I think
mm,
it's amazing because we could be talking about a self nominally, or we could be talking about a book project, or
yeah, yeah.
as well. And I like that doubling. Um, sorry. So tell me, like, maybe you should continue. Actually, I feel like I
Yeah.
interrupted. Yeah, my bad.
No, and that was like a book length poem. So that was just like it wasn't like anything interweaved or anything. I don't think it was
Mhm.
very good. Which is why I haven't. I think I might have recycled some stuff from it, but it was between that and the other manuscript I've been writing, which ended up being called Ransack. Um, and that was, I think, very informed by these kind of letters to Orlando that I had been writing all year, but didn't really know what to do with. Um, because my supervisor wanted something accessible, and I was like, letter writing. Is that more accessible than the weird other things I'm showing you? And so yeah, I ended up kind of sticking with that, and then it came time to choose between those two manuscripts, and well, the formerly known as something that could fit in a box, I hadn't showed anyone else, so that would have kind of been blindsiding everyone if I submitted that, and I didn't know, I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. I'd gotten some feedback on some of the Ransack work, so I ended up submitting that for the um yeah for the final thesis or whatever. And yeah, it didn't really change much between that submission and publication. There's maybe like two poems added
Mhm.
after, and then maybe some last minute rearranging because you're like, oh, that could make like a resonance here if I put this
Yeah.
here or whatever. But it was pretty much the same except for um, because Stephanie Burt was my outside marker um, for the manuscript, and I had written this to kind of cap off the Orlando poems. I'd written this very long blackout poem of like the end.
Mhm.
Well, it's not the end of the book, but it's the ending in the play of Orlando. And she's just like, it's not a very good blackout poem. And I was just like, okay, cool. So, I was able to cut 30 pages from the book very quickly. Um, yeah. And then
Okay.
yeah.
So we've talked about, I guess, the some of the other projects that were around Ransack, so to speak, or that
Mm,
like informed it by, not being it in some ways, or like,
yeah.
you could see them as being distinct in some ways. So in terms of Ransack itself and that what you did hand in, um, and you already mentioned the letters to Orlando that in a way I feel like is definitely at least one layer of connective tissue um
Mm,
running through that. Because for me, right, when I think about that question, how do you make a poetry book cohesive? Like I can think of a few different ways, right? One is you can have a linear plot or narrative, right? Like following a novel, so to speak, that people can kind of hang on to, and then perhaps you have some like parallel elements that float around. Then you can have things like a recurring concept or a recurring address to a some entity, in this case
mm.
Orlando, right? This is like a refrain of sorts. Um, when you were working on Ransack, how how much were you conscious of all these different ways of making something, making all these parts connect, so to speak?
Yeah, because the original plan was that Orlando would be one strand of many kind of like
Hmm.
literary figures that I was writing
Ah,
to. But then I think I just didn't want to waste Stephanie's time. um, so I didn't want to, give her like 300 pages of like amateur poetry. um, so I ended up, yeah, just going with because I think who did I? I also had some poems that were written to Hilda Doolittle or HD's Helen. Um, and I think Jesus was probably there as well. I don't know.
yeah. So
Um,
yeah, the addressing these historical figures was definitely one of the main strategies.
yeah.
Um,
And I think I just written the most for Orlando, and so it was like and it seems to be like I felt like I was mining into something that was quite interesting,
yeah,
um, and made sense to me, or would be apparent. I think it would be apparent to the reader why I chose Orlando in some ways, and that like maybe obscure HD's Helen might not might not. Um, just with the gender stuff being quite at the forefront of that novel. Um, yeah, I was very. It's why I think it's why I think my books have like many endings. Is that I'm trying to like tie up loose ends when I get to the end of a book. Like I kind of want it to be like have resonances with the start of the book, and then have like this through line. So for Ransack, I have the letters to Orlando, and then I have the more. I think they were like these like center defined kind of
yeah,
almost essayistic. Um, so they like vary in how essay like they are kind of searching through like gender. Um,
yeah.
and
Because
then
that was something I
yeah,
want to ask you about as well. That in Ransack, there are quite a few different registers that are at play. Um,
mm,
you have the kind of more intimate, like letter address with Orlando, for
mm,
instance. You have these more essayistic moments where uh, the terminology becomes quite scientific as well. You have the more
Mm.
personal lyric moments. Um, did you, yeah, maybe the question is, were these written in different like moods or modes? Did you write them in a chunk? Like, uh, so for example, like with the Orlando ones, I know that clearly was written, they were written together in a sense.
Mm.
Um, for the rest of them, did you find yourself being like, okay, I'm in a kind of like an essayistic mood. I'm going to write these kind of essay poems, or no, it just kind of happened that these tones just came out as you were writing these different registers.
Well, I think, because it's like the first book, and like for me, I wanted it to have like a very rounded like representation of the things I like to do.
Yeah, yeah.
And so yeah, it was just kind of like, here's this like basically a love poem for someone, and then
Hmm.
here's this, I just found all these scientific words interesting and threw them at the page. Um, yeah, it's just, I don't know. I think it's probably, I just get bored real easily, so I like doing different things, and I think poetry is really cool because you can just on to the next thing really, really easily
Yeah,
in a way.
I find that
Um,
to be a bit of a gift curse, and that's why I always come back to how do you make it all fit? Because you
yeah.
almost have too much freedom. And in a way, as I've gotten, more experience writing, I'm almost looking for constraints first.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, because possibilities become almost too much, too overwhelming.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know. I think that's also like why I called the book Ransack. It's kind of like I was like
yes.
almost like ransacking like like possibilities of what I could be writing in my in my own head rather than
And you use the term
um
representational, I do think that, of course, our minds are not this like unified, single-threaded
mm,
things. Like, all
no.
these disparate bits, fragments, conflicting dialects, registers, tones, like are all floating around. And I love that your book captures that. I like poetry books that kind of perform the mind, so to speak.
Mm,
And I feel like Ransack definitely does that. So a slightly different take on these questions. So I guess moving away from like maybe the structural side of things to more like anecdotal, experiential as the writer. When you were ransacking your mind, like when you're dealing with memory, when you're dealing with past, like I'm always curious, like w did you have to go digging, or were those things that were already kind of pressing on your membrane, so to speak? I'm sure it's a combination of both, but
um there was there was a few things that I don't think ended up in the book that I went digging for. Like it was a kind of,
mm,
because my mom wrote a poem for me like not long after I was born. And so I wanted, I kind of asked
amazing.
her for like a photo of that so I could like use it in some way. Because there's that long poem about, being in the womb essentially.
Yes.
And I wanted to find a way to fit that in, but I just couldn't fit it.
Hmm.
And so that was kind of like research into my past I had to do. But otherwise, um, I kind of just trusted my memory, because a lot of the ways in which like a lot of the voice in a lot of the poems is kind of, I wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't say it's dishonest, but it's like honest to a certain experience of the world, and I didn't really mind if like what I was saying didn't actually happen. It's like what I remember, and it's like
Yeah,
especially in the stream of consciousness stuff, it's like, well, that's that's what's here.
I really like that
Yeah.
too. I do think that in a way, accepting the finitude or accepting the incompleteness um, is actually really powerful. And yeah, like you're saying, it almost becomes a picture of, yeah, again, it's more the picture of the mind rather than like a set of affairs or events in the world,
Mm, mm,
more like a phenomenological kind of
mm.
experience, which I think poetry clearly excels at delivering. And I think your book definitely does deliver on that. Um, one other thing about the process of Ransack, um, are the texts, intertextuality. You've sort of already alluded to some of this, but what role did other texts play in the process of, did you ransack other texts, basically?
Um, I think I was really into. I think Lynn Hedinian's My Life actually is in the book, mentioned in the book, but I
Yep,
was like really
it
into
is.
that book.
Yeah, me too.
Or Lynn Hedinian's My Life in the 90s. It's like the
Yeah,
kind of double version.
that's right.
Um, I just thought that was incredible in the ways in which like the poems would echo with each other, and then just like the style of the writing. I just found very appealing at the time.
Yeah, it's like hyper paratactic style,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Um, and also I think I have the book right here. Uh, Aaron Epps, Der
Mm,
Herculean, which I think I've brought up like a million times, but it was just the like letter writing or epistolary form was just
yeah.
like really appealing and basically why I wrote the Orlando poems. Um, and it's definitely informed like the kind of mood. Because Dear Herculean is a very dark book. It's like pressed up against death throughout the whole
Mm,
thing, essentially. And like the ways in which it's like has this really kind of quite depressing thesis, which is basically like we can have queer bodies when we're dead. Um, and it's yeah, it just goes real hard on that. But there's like a lot of like joy and hope inside it, but it's yeah, it's quite a I don't know. It feels like being trapped inside a giant slug. Um,
yeah.
and I kind of wanted to speak to a little bit of that in the um in Ransack. Though I think I also bring Herculean into my work in Echidna um
Yeah.
later on. Beast Feast by Cody Rose Clevedence. It's a book that I was obsessed with for a long time, just because it was like I think it was the first poetry collection I read where like my response was, "How did they get away with this?"
Well, I'm curious, like with these other books, are they right there with you on the desk, so to speak, or are they kind of distant but resonant, both? Or
I think, well, yeah, at the time they would have just been there. I had like a very small kind of collection of poetry stuff that I, kind of attend to when I was thinking about writing in a certain style. Like kind of read a little bit of what someone else has done, and then that gives you kind of like a starting point.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think I have a poem for Cody in Ransack that like ends with kind of like I think I mentioned like dick jokes. Just because they have a poem called Poppycock and Asphodel, which has like cock and ass in the
Ah,
in the title,
yes.
but it's like this really kind of beautiful melodic poem that just has all these dick jokes in it. But it's like so like I don't know poetic. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem like a joke. It just seems like eternally sincere. Um, but I just really like this. There's like something.
Amazing.
It's like the poet's kind of winking at you, and you're like, "Is it?
Yeah.
Am I supposed to laugh? Am I supposed to be laughing at this?" I don't know. I found that really yeah, and just reading it out loud, it's just like a really beautiful. It's a really beautiful rhythm. Um,
So I was going to ask you as well, like, um, after thinking about these other texts, looking back at the whole journey of Ransack in general, like, were there were there parts of the book that surprised you when they came out of you, so to speak? How much of the process was, in retrospect, how much of the process was just not anticipated versus how much of the process involved you kind of having like more of a conscious design or intent? Um,
Um, so I think a lot of it was kind of spontaneous or felt spontaneous. And my favorite poems in the book now are the ones like I had no kind of prep or like big thoughts about before I wrote them,
mhm.
because they are the ones that feel like they're written by someone else, which I like when your own work can get like that, because it's like, oh, you can kind of see it with some distance, which I like. And so all those kinds of poems, like I think they're like, I think my estrogen surreal is one of them. Uh when you go out in your favorite dress and feel like shit, I think that's the title. I don't know, it's like the longest title. But those two poems are like kind of short and weird and surreal, and I like them a lot because I just don't know where they came from.
Do you think that they emerged in part due to the other things that were already there? Um,
Oh, definitely. Like I wouldn't have felt comfortable leaving them in the book if they like, or even like writing them if I didn't feel like I had like, because they were easily my least favorite poems when the book was published. I was just kind of like, what are they doing? I don't know what it's doing. And like
because, mm,
the like
sorry, keep going.
the conception poem, which took 6 months to write, like on and off. Like I just kept working on it and was like not sure if it was going to go in the book or not. Um, which I don't know. I found it funny. It took me 6 months to write, and I was in the womb for 6 months, as it were. And it's like a funny resonance. I'm like, I guess it has to go on. That poem, I feel, I don't know. That's a poem I go back and forth on a lot because it just felt so torturous to write. Um, and then I'll never forget Stephanie's feedback on it, which was like, this poem denies the question of how you could have done this to your mother. I'm like, does it? Because you wrote the question. So
That's
yeah,
amazing.
that's a thing. Um,
Because I don't know if you find this, but when I was working on the books, I noticed that there would always be this kind of back and forth between the totality of everything that was there, and then obviously the bits themselves. So what I mean is like often I might start with a whole bunch of bits, notice that something is emerging from them,
mm,
some patterns, commonalities, tease those things out, and then somehow going somehow then it might put pressure again on bits that might be missing from that point, or not missing, but
mm.
bits that I could see coming in now that those higher level patterns have emerged. Um, did you find there was much back and forth between the kind of like meta structure, so to speak, of the book, or the, overall structure of the book and the individual bits, poems? Later on, I guess this would be like a later stage thing.
Yeah, I think that was what I kind of did when I added like I think the two or three poems I added very late.
Yeah, yeah,
Was like, oh, there's this theme here, and I need to kind of I want to have like this one poem make a bit more sense by having like two others go
yeah,
with it. And I think that happened a lot was like, okay, there's all this stuff on childhood that keeps coming in. So I want to have that in the book, but I don't want to have like the being born poem to be first because I feel feel like that's too typical or something. Um, and I don't know, I feel like you can only go back to your birth once you've grown a bit. um, yeah.
yeah,
There was definitely a lot of like just back and forth, which I think is one of the things that's really difficult about putting a collection together. It's because as soon as you add something new, that creates a whole different vibe.
yeah.
And
I feel like it's
I
almost
think
like a
for
spiral. every
Yeah,
bit you add involves you kind of going back over everything else that's there to see how, how it's changed everything else, or what new
yeah.
connections
Does
it
it
may
all
have
still
formed,
fit,
or
or
yeah.
it's like the yeah. And I think that's something I had to do with like making Orlando the central thing. Was like had to cut so much stuff because it was just referencing other things that no longer existed. um, but yeah, editing poetry collections is there's a lot of I don't know. I feel like editing in poetry is interesting because it's not very different from writing it. I feel like for
It's
me,
not,
the
no.
editing process is just as like generative and then also inspires you to write more things to make like something flow better, or and then that's like a whole new poem you have to fit into the scheme of things. And yeah, it's
Because I
happened a few
think
times.
I feel like this isn't talked about that often, because when people think about editing, they just think about like the individual pieces and whether those pieces are like as, good as they could be, as opposed to
Mm,
thinking about the larger structure and how all those pieces might fit together, like we've been talking about, whether they're potentially missing pieces or pieces that could embellish, or yeah. Um, so that's really, really interesting.
it
Um,
was, it was also like remind me of we'd have a lot of discussions about whether you should order a poetry collection in like a specific order or just like have it, especially in regards to you have your like kind of poetry collections which are like the greatest hits or whatever.
mhm,
um and where I landed on that was I would like the reader to be rewarded if they decide to read it from start to finish,
mhm.
but they don't have to because it is a poetry collection. Like they could just go into the thing and read what they like, because I think that's something that's cool about poetry. It's like
Yeah.
you can just open it in the middle and read a thing and be like, oh, that was like a little bite-sized story or whatever experience.
Yes.
But
I
I like there to be some kind of reward if you do kind of decide to read the poetry collection like a novel.
I was at times I was like being conceptually quite greedy, and I like this concept of like block time, i.e. like all times exist in like a kind of like
Yeah.
this massive like block, and you don't have to travel linearly through it. You can kind of like enter it like it's a forest or something. And
Yeah.
I think it's actually also maybe a more accurate way of how we deal with our internal time, right? Because,
Mm,
so to speak, I don't know, that's probably not a very good term for it, but your sense of past, your sense of future, um, in your internal psyche always feels like it's all concurrent.
mm,
That everything's actually always there at the same time, so to speak. And I like that, like, um, poetry books like this can give you that kind of feeling.
mm, yeah.
Um, I kind of want to segue to Echidna, but
Mhm.
was there anything else that you wanted to highlight about, the process or journey of, Ransack before we move?
Um, One of the things that surprised me going back and looking at like publication dates and stuff is that I had published poems that were about Echidna before Ransack had even come out,
Mhm.
which was
Yeah.
surprising to me for some reason because I see them as like two different kind of eras or sections or whatever of my like writing life or whatever. And actually, there was like more overlap than I thought because I felt like I wrote probably more the year after my masters than I did during it because I felt liberated not having all the kind of expectations or whatever of that course. And so I think that's where Echidna came from, was like one of many. Yeah. I guess we can just move on to talk about Echidna really.
Yeah. Did you want to take a short break? Because
Um,
this is probably like a good moment. Are you happy?
I'm all good. Like, how are you feeling?
I'm good. I'm just wondering when I need to pee next, but I think we're okay now.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
so
like drinking all the
yeah,
water, so probably. I was
I've
thinking
had a
of
lot of tea. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I did want to draw on something you mentioned just then. Right. Yes. So the succession, like one book following, another. I I can definitely relate to what you said, i.e., like the fact that the second book ended up kind of being more of an overlap with the first than you might have initially thought,
Mm,
or you even thought at publication. And I can definitely see that with my two books as well, where like, yeah, I thought the next one was radically different, but when I look back at it, I'm like, this could almost be a weird abstraction of the first one, or just
mm.
like a strange alternate
It does feel
perspective.
like it. My like impression reading Underglass. Is that
Yeah.
yeah, that's the title. Yeah, it felt like a kind of shadow
Yeah.
of the first book in some ways. I don't even know
Yeah.
how I could.
Ghost of the first book somehow.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
even though it is very different. Um,
And I think it's
yeah.
very interesting for your books as well, right? Like, formally speaking, they are very different, like in terms of the registers and like the referential worlds, they are quite different. But I think
Mm,
well, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this, from obviously from certain perspectives, they do overlap. Now, one thing that I would point out as being one of the major, I think, stylistic differences is, well, one is obviously it's framed as a play with dramatis persona, and
mm,
mythology plays an even bigger part in this one. And so I think
mm.
one of my initial questions that I had was like, what's the relationship between biography and mythology for you? And in the context of writing Echidna.
Um, well, it's actually what I wanted to do. In the master's year, it was like part of my like proposal for that course was like do like biomythography or something like that. I think that's Audre Lorde's term.
Right.
Um, and then it just didn't happen in the way I wanted. Like the book just didn't like I either forgot completely about that thing I wrote in my application, which is I think quite common. You're like, what the hell am I writing?
100%. I
Um,
mean, definitely true for me. Yep.
yeah. It's like I don't know what any of these words mean that I've said I would do, so I'm gonna write something else. But then I think that idea is just still kind of stuck around. And I was actually Echidna came from a project um, that I started, which was called the 100 Heads of the Hydra,
Hmm.
and I wanted to write like 100 poems, and they each be about like Hydra in a different way, like because the word is used for a lot of different things.
Hmm.
Um, and like the the small eternal living creature that like can kill things with its biological gun. I don't think that's what they call it, but it does seem to work like that. And then like the creature in um Greek mythology, and then the this Nazi equivalent in Marvel movies. Um, and so yeah, it was kind of like just scattered, like looking at all these things, and then I was like, oh well, who's Hydra related to? Like, what is their kind of like family situation? And can I get into that? And then that's where Echidna comes from, because Echidna is the mother of the Hydra and the Chimera and all these things. Um, and then I don't know, Echidna just kind of I think I um like 3 syllable names. It just was nice to write Orlando, and it was also nice to write Echidna over and over again. So I think I think that was part of it. Um, yeah, and then it just ended up growing and growing and kind of becoming its own thing. Um,
Because
yeah.
on the topic of the dramatic figures that you introduced at the beginning of the book, did you, when you started, it's always weird to say when you started writing the book, because often you don't know that you started writing the book, but
Yeah.
when you first started writing the poems that would end up in the book, did you already have a set of these figures in mind? How, or how big a set did you have? How many of them did you add as you went on with the book?
Um, so in my mind, at the start, Echidna and Typhon were going to be the main characters essentially. Um, Typhon being I guess, the husband, the other Titan. Um, but it just didn't like he shows up once, which is in one of the earlier poems I'd written for the book. Um, and then I did end up writing like a poem about his death, but that I just didn't want to include it in the book. Um, yeah, I think it was all very organic. Like the dramatis personae was like one of the last things added to the book. I just thought
Mm.
it was a nice. I thought it was. I don't know. I think humor is a good way to get people into something, and
Yep,
I don't know. I find I find that page quite humorous.
it is. It must have been fun writing that list as well and giving
Yeah,
each figure
yeah,
like a little, you know, yeah.
yeah. As as memed on by me, essentially. Um,
Well, isn't that it's very
so
Greek, right? Like it's
yeah,
very like yeah.
I was trying to do a few things. I was trying to like make it kind of feel like an old timey book in some ways, like especially with Echidna having that like also the alternative title, which is like way too long. Um, yeah, and then also having like the Greek characters at the start, like the first page has Echidna and the the original alphabet, I guess. Um, uh, yeah, like it was some kind of like artifact from another time, but I don't know.
Because one other thing I noticed in how different the strategy was in the second book was that I found in the first book there were a number of moments where you made uh the metaphysics, so to speak, or the politics or the philosophy of like quite explicit, i.e., like you were presenting certain arguments there on the page, whereas it felt like in the second book a lot of it was implicit. A lot of those
Mm.
ideas, concepts, arguments were implicit and kind of being performed either by the book or by the characters or the um, selves. Um, do you agree with that take? It was just something that I kind of felt, but I don't know. Was it a conscious thing or it just happened that way?
I think so. One of the earliest things I decided was that the whole thing would be in third person, and it kind of breaks it in some ways, but like I don't know, dialogue and stuff gets messy, especially in poetry. But I think the third person definitely shaped a lot of these things as well. Um,
Because you felt like there was less space for like internal kind of monologue or like internal
mm,
dialogue logic being played out.
yeah,
Interesting.
whereas like Ransack was like trying to get into that as you know, uh, like in terms of I don't know the distance between me and the like narrator in Rainsack is like pretty much like one to one at the time at least. I'm a different person than I was when I wrote that book. But Echidna was like a lot more distanced, even though there's a lot of me in all of the characters, especially Echidna. But Echidna did start off as
Well,
being conceived as a friend of mine more than me.
well, it's quite a cool inversion, right? From that point of view. Like, so with a paraphrase of what you just said is like for Ransack, it was a representation of like an internal world, so to speak. And then
Mm,
in this one, it's not that it's not an internal world, but the internal world is being performed by these like external
mm.
uh figures, characters, so to speak. Um, I wonder if as well, and this is obviously more personal, less about process, but I also wonder if by that point, some of what you believed had been more cemented, and it was easier for you to kind of just like run as though you were taking those conclusions for granted. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
Yeah, well, I was like writing Echidna was a lot less insecure about like my gender, essentially. Um, like not that it's a solved equation. I don't think any kind of I don't know. I feel like there's you should be always open to change and stuff like that when it comes to identity. But
But there was
y
something had stabilized. Yeah,
yeah, I just felt kind of more secure, and it was just like, well, what kind of world can I build from that like security, essentially, and
yeah.
wanting to kind of I don't know. I think there's like a lot of poetry collections that do the like feminist inversion of some Greek story or whatever. And so it was very much in that tradition. And then also just kind of trying to find there are reasons to be referencing the Greeks. Because it happens a lot. Like you read like New Zealand poetry and it happens all the time. And I just felt a bit like, oh, well, how can I make these characters like actually a part of the whenua rather than just kind of referencing it in some kind of way that's like I don't know, tipping your hat or I don't know, like showing off. I don't know. There seems to be a sense of
Yeah,
like,
I
I
know what
read
you
a
mean.
Greek story, so I must be a poet.
I totally get it. Yeah, it's like kind of referencing them to get like more like cultural clout or something, but
mm,
they
mm,
sometimes don't really do the work in the
mm,
work. Yeah, I can
yeah,
definitely agree with that.
yeah. So I was trying to, yeah, like that's why like Echidna is described as Takatapui, rather
Yeah.
than, like just sticking to some kind of more uh canonical um kind of description of who she was in the Greek tradition.
Oh, well, the
Um,
ransack strategy carries on in that sense, right? Like you're kind of reimagining
mm,
like there are a few different good terms for this. Um, I like the idea of like maladaptation or like
mm,
I used to like saying misappropriation, but that has so much baggage I don't say that anymore. But I think to like maladapt something is quite cool. Like you've taken
mm,
something and like you've repurposed it, right? Like some kind of like
yeah.
backwater mechanic.
Well,
Um,
like I think when I started thinking about like the project more academically as I got further into it, I was thinking about like how the Victorians like had done that to Greek mythology, to Christianity, to Maori puraka. Like there's a lot of things which you kind of wonder if the similarities between like a is it the Trials of Hercules and like
mm,
Maui's own kind of tribulations. Is it because
yes.
the same people that are writing the stories down, and they actually were like maybe quite different originally from each other. And so yeah, like that was why those like threads um ended up being throughout because I just felt, well, what if I purposely maladapt them away from like kind of heteronormative
Keep talking. I'm just
um
gonna check on my cat, but I'm
yeah
listening.
um yeah like yeah reinterpret them away from the kind of very white supremacist, um, homophobic, transphobic kind of modes that they're kind of been distorted in by those earlier, I guess, ethnographers, uh, settlers. Yeah.
I think there's definitely something very powerful about that. Um, the other question I had for you about this book is that many of the poems are dedicated to different people in your life.
Mm,
And how whenever I see a dedication, I'm always curious, like, did you have that person in mind when you were writing it, or did you see them in it later? Was it a combination of both?
Um, I think it's probably a mix of things. Um, but for the most part, it was like a declaration of writing the poem for that person, like say like the intended audience is like the four is actually doing like the work you'd usually expect it to do, I guess. Um, in that it is for that person. But there were some where that was added afterwards because I was like, oh, that's where I've drawn these influences from, or like a kind of way of referencing, but then also yeah, it's kind of like wanting to, I don't know, show this like community that exists in the work. Because so often it's like, the writer is this
Yeah.
singular entity that exists in a room and just pulls things out of thin air or whatever. Like not that it ever really happens, but
No, but
it's like
that is certainly like a naive, I would say, model of how writing works, right? Or how any kind of creative process works, that you kind of just it just
yeah,
kind of comes out of nowhere. You've been struck by something. Find it to be a very also like masculine idea and very ejaculatory in a masculine sense, right?
yeah.
Um,
Um yeah, well like I wouldn't be writing if I wasn't in community with other writers. Like I just like that's part of what has kept me going for like it quite a steady pace for like the last I don't know how many years. I think 2014 is when I started writing
oh
a
yeah.
lot.
Okay, well, I do save this thought because I do want to return to that
Mm,
towards the end because after talking about the books,
yeah,
I think I was saying to you, I did want to like talk to you about the writing life as a more
yeah.
general thing, and people obviously are a big part of that. Let me just think about if there's anything else I wanted to mention or ask you about Echidna. Um, well, we have a bit of time, and I was thinking maybe we could explore some of the ideas a bit more.
Hmm.
Some of these ideas have already come up, like one thing that one question or idea that I'm always interested in is the idea that language is a gift, this like major gift curse. That on the one hand, it's enabling us to do all these amazing things, and enable us to communicate with each other, to create models of things in our minds. But at the same time, it's also very much constraining and reducing what is possible, right? In a sense.
Mm.
How important, I feel like this is a kind of an important idea in your work. And yeah, I don't know, what do you think about that kind of sense of duality in language, and how does it present itself to you?
I think, and this is very much like hindsight looking back on them. Ransack is very much the language sucks book, whereas like Echidna is like here's what we can build with it though. Um, yeah, because yeah, it's a major thing. Like just like even just thinking about it in regards to like transitioning and the kind of words that like it was it's a lot easier for someone I've only just met who isn't like transphobic, I guess, to be like, oh, this is who you are, that's fine. Versus someone I've known since I was a kid who has this like idea of me as a boy and as like all these other things that they could that they've generated in their head, and just like the um it's even some of my family still calling me by my old name, which is shows that they're still using my old name, which is like it's it's all these ways in which like your identity becomes like calcified by language. And you know, it kind of this version of you sticks in people's heads, and then as soon as you like present something that's different to it, um, then that reaches the limits of their language. And when you know, often when we reach the limits of language, we reach violence or violent responses, right? Um, like people like that's essentially what it is when people like verbally harass me when I go and get my pie from the dairy or whatever. Is that they've I've reached I represent some point at which they can't like language me into their
Yeah,
world,
you've
and
kind of
they're just like,
exceeded their model of the world, so to speak.
yeah, it's like it's like really sad in a lot of ways. And yeah, um, yeah, and then we are speaking like a language with a history that has a quite fraught history, and um is a language that is quite complex because it's a conqueror's tongue, essentially. um,
Yep, I was going to mention that too.
and like we, we had to be aware of that. And um, I think also like interacting with like Te Reo Māori, and I did like a year course, which I've forgotten most of now, but just having, that possibility for a different language, and that, it obviously comes with all its baggages, and it also has been influenced by English. There's a reason why we write English looking characters um
True.
when we're writing Te Reo Māori down. Um but it's something
Maybe
I am less bothered by in my everyday than I used to be, because it's just like I don't know what to do about that.
I it kind of reminds me of when we were talking about the transition from Ransack to Echidna, in that
Mhm.
sense, where this is a quite a funny model from William Blake, where you have like experience, no, innocence, then experience, and then like I think he
Yeah.
calls it like higher experience, or is it no, higher innocence, something like that, where
Yeah.
it's kind of like the synthesis of both, where you've done you've kind of had your moment of like angst and like perhaps like inertia in your resentment and like and then you kind of emerge from it and you're like, okay, let's take for granted now that is the world. And I'll stop despairing to quite this degree.
Yeah.
But what can I do now, given that this is
Mm.
the world, right? Um, because the other thing I wanted to ask you was, talking about this constraint duality of language, this like weird gift curse that it is for us. And obviously it's a very important thing for you in all these different ways. Did you have kind of like explicit strategies for how you wanted to either draw attention to this, or try to build your way out of it in some way? Yeah, I don't know how well I've articulated that. And we've sort of touched on it a little bit, where in like Ransack, there are moments where you're quite explicit about what language is doing, I
Mhm.
think, and how it's good and not good. In Echidna, I feel like again the strategies are different. But okay, so give you a sense of what I mean here. Like I find it really cool that some of the figures, the mythological figures you've chosen, have some aspect of manyness to them. And why I think this is important to language is because language does this thing where it assumes things are like one thing. And
Mm.
I mean that in a number of ways. Like
Mm.
it assumes that, it can seem like um, one person is just like any other person, right? For example, it can seem like how you where something ends and something begins is like very clear, but in reality, those things are not clear at all.
Mm.
Um, like right now, sitting on this chair, like on a, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but on some kind of like particle or molecular level, like I'm sure that I'm mixed with this chair and my clothes and
Mm,
like all these things. So I'm not a discrete entity. And
mm,
in fact, most things in the world, physical things that you would count as being a single thing are like probably just splayed out, across
mm.
and like are connected to so many other things. So I think even this notion of like radical interconnectedness, the idea that you can't easily count things as one, these are things that do strain against what the typical model of language, seems to propose, which, yeah, those are separate things. You can treat them differently, blah, blah, or treat them the same. Or um, how conscious were you of like dealing with this kind of problem in the books? And so, like Echidna has like two tails, right? And like there's the aspect of like many-headedness for Hydra. Like, yeah, were these explicit strategies of yours? Or am I
So,
predicting?
so for Echidna, I like the reason it's a poetry collection and not a novel is that I wanted the flexibility that the form allows to kind of mess with setting and age. Um, like Echidna is not really the same person twice throughout the book. Um, and so that was like a important thing to me for some reason. And I think because I
I'll
did
just
have this
say,
like
sorry, really quick interjection. I think that's a really good point because I think what I was pointing to was more almost like spatial oneness, but now you're saying in time as well, there
mm,
things are not one thing through time, right? Yeah.
mm, um what was it?
Sorry, did you lose your threads?
That's so good. Yeah, that was like one of the things I had to like be like figure out actually quite deep into the project was do I want this to be a novel? Do I want this to be a play? Do I want this to be a poetry collection? And I was like, what is it taking advantage of? And yeah. And so it ended up being a poetry collection. Um because of that, I think like there's a lot of continuity in the book, but like I didn't want it to like I feel like a novel requires continuity in a way. Like not all novels. Like I could just, you know, um I guess some people would call Echidna a verse novel if they wanted to. Um, but yeah, there was just this flexibility that like the packet of a poem kind of allowed me at least in regards to kind of dissipating the need for like a continuous identity or like a coherent identity. Um, we're still telling
Yeah.
quite like a bit more simple story, like because it is kind of feels at least to me, it's like childhood and then getting older and then it's not always like that straightforward, but it has like
I
the
get what you
trappings
mean
of
though.
of that. Yeah.
I get what you mean. Like I think it's an effective strategy to kind of blend in some more linear elements with your, kind of less linear elements. And I've always thought that like for better or worse, you do need to find like a sweet spot where the reader does have enough like handholds, or a certain kind of reader has enough handholds to be able to like pass through, so to speak. Um,
Yeah, that was
I think
oh
you go first.
um a big difference to me at least between the books is that I wanted because there's a lot of books I really like which are just the vibe is that you read it in one sitting and I don't necessarily have the attention span for that nowadays um for whatever reason um like there's a book called I think I've got it right here. It's called Listen, My Friend, This is the Dream I Dreamed Last Night. It's vicarious evidence, and it's one paragraph. It's just one paragraph. It's not more than one paragraph. It's just so like the kind of bargain you're making with the author or the reader from the author's perspective is like you read this in one sitting, you don't stop, you get to the end, and then like something happens. And that was very much like my intent with Ransack, because it is like this continuous thing. But so in my mind, I kind of wanted it to be okay for people to stop on the poems, like the letters. But for Echidna, I wanted it to be a lot more clear where you can stop, like where you can put down the book. It's like why
Yep.
I divided a 96-page book into 7 parts. So I wanted it to be very manageable, because it's quite like I don't know. I like to think that the poems are quite full. Like each poem is like
Yep.
full of like some kind of emotional quality, but then also like all these references to something else. But
This is great because
yeah.
I think that this is also something that's not maybe that often talked about, where again you're dealing with this tension of like the digestion of the whole and the digestion of parts of the whole, and how you can structure it in such a way that you're giving people like break points or like rest points or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's just, that I think that's quite weird. Like coming from programming land, I think of it as like user experience almost, like the
Mm,
ergonomics of the book,
mm,
so to speak. Um, and I don't think that I cared nearly as much about this when I first started writing, but increasingly like, no, it makes sense. Like, and I wouldn't go past a certain point, but I think you do need to like show some care for, these possible reading processes. Um, but yeah, it's very interesting to think about like how
yeah,
how how you expect someone else is going to digest your work, and
mm.
different people too.
Well, I think it was because I find novels with short chapters a lot easier, a lot
Yeah,
easier to get
same.
through. And so I was just kind of like, okay, like if that's my experience, I should probably write a book that isn't just like one long chunk. Um,
Because even
yeah,
even if it's something arbitrary like adding white space, it does make a huge difference, right?
mm,
Even if
mm,
it was one long poem, but you just had a blank,
yeah.
blank space here and there, it does make a huge difference, which is also fascinating to me still.
Well, yeah, there's something I kind of noticed in Simone Caho's Heal,
Hmm.
and how like it is essentially one long piece, but it's in I think 3 parts. And that like I don't know, I was really thankful for the partitioning, especially in that book, because it's like a quite what's the word? I can't think of the word. Grueling isn't the right, because like I really like the process of reading the book is really enjoyable. But like it is very
It's heavy.
harrowing.
Yeah.
That's the um
Yeah.
word. And so I was like having those parts I thought was really good use of
Yeah.
the
And I
sort of
mean,
space.
that's, I think, generally what we're touching on here is just like thinking about weight and relief,
Mm,
um, for very powerful, books or very heavy works. Um, there's actually a big question for me that I feel like every book is like an attempt at an answer, which is how you represent or write trauma in general.
mm,
How do you do it well? How do you do it responsibly? How do you do it effectively?
mm.
Like, it's very, very, very difficult set of problems. Um, at some point, someone asked me to write an essay about it. I'm like, I don't know the answer. Like, what?
Yeah, well,
Um,
that's something I was thinking about a lot. But like in differentiating Echidna from Ransack, because Ransack's a lot about like personal like gender trauma essentially, and then Echidna, I think at least to me, it's obvious that she hasn't had the best life or isn't living, the most comfortable existence, and that some awful things have happened to her. But I didn't want to focus on any of like the worst things, essentially, like in terms of like gendered violence and um whatnot. And like that's not to say that people shouldn't. Like I think there's a lot of
Of course.
conversations where it can go down the like the I don't know, the path where like prescribing a way to do things to, and especially to like marginalized writers. Um, and I don't think that's useful because there's already enough things stopping us from writing. Um,
Yeah,
but I
100%.
felt for me with that book, I wanted to just I don't know. It was less about being responsible and maybe more about like creating some variety. Um, I kind of like I know that the books will have similarities because it's just me writing them. But I
And
wanted
I
to
think for
just
me, it also does come back to the sense that like you're just using quite different strategies, right?
mm,
And again, to come back to that old thing about language and how you deal with its gift cursedness and how you draw attention to it slash use it slash like deconstruct it. I think a couple of things here. Like for Echidna, I think the mythology biography thing is another way of actually kind of it's a provocation of language in a sense,
mm,
or it's a provocation about writing and how you can or cannot write this about yourself or about the past. Or at least it performs that, right? It kind of
mm,
problematizes um, the concept of like autobiography, um, and that has to do with language, what language can and cannot do ultimately. And then the other
mm,
sense of what you were saying, kind of like endless becoming.
mm,
The fact that it's nominally one person, but they're not the same person like through time, right? They're constantly
mm,
changing, and that's yeah another thing that language can't really handle very well,
mm.
um, because of a name. But yeah, it's just these like funny puzzles that language presents, I guess. Um,
Yeah, I think that's also like the power of a name is also part of why the book ends once she has her new name, like and is actually able to live it. Because like there isn't like there's something about the project that needs the like kind of that unifying thing, and once it's gone, it's like, well, part of it is um kind of leaving the fiction is like the part of the reason the last poem is how it is because it's like it's even shaped like an echidna quill necklace I was given. Um the like reality of the poem is just something I experienced, whereas like not many of the poems throughout the book that they usually like
it's just so correct that it's a spiral, I have to say. Yeah.
um
'Cause
yeah.
I think a spiral just sums up that tension so well, where it's
Mm,
the same and it's not the same at every point, you know? It's always the same and it's different at every point.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, well that's like something that's really cool about like at the center Te Ao Māori in our perception of time is that it's a spiral, and
yes.
that
Hmm.
um and that your ancestors are also your descendants. Like that's why I have that lane slash at the start, because it's like
Yeah.
we this continuous cycle of things.
For me, that's
um
the alternative kind of geometric model to the what I was calling like a block time. Spiral time is
mm,
very similar. Yeah,
mm.
in function, I would say.
Yeah, and
Um,
like a lot of I don't know if I talked about it much, but a lot of the language I think in like the play was inspired by like Carrie Hume's writing, and she has a lot of like I feel like I think of if I think of any author in spirals, it's like her. um yeah.
Okay, well, this is probably a good moment, I reckon, for us to talk about like the life of like the writing life.
Yeah.
Again, something else that I don't feel people get to talk about very much. And I feel like if you're it's probably one of the few audience asides I might do, but if you're a younger writer, or an emerging writer, I feel like these are a lot of the questions that you have, but no one really like, you may not often get to talk to someone about it.
Yeah.
And so I'll start with just, saying you've been written for most of your life, so by the sounds of it.
Mm, mm.
And that's been a sustained, consistent habit. And for a lot of people, that's incredible, you know, especially now at this point where you're no longer at school, you no longer have the luxury of just knowing you have like these big holidays or whatever, like you're free
Yeah.
from various responsibilities. Like, I don't know where to start really, but it's like, what is it like to always be writing?
So I think a lot of it, especially when I started moving into poetry, it was like very like a diary. It was like, I'm just confused. I don't know what's going on. I
It's
need
a way of
something to,
processing.
yeah, yeah. And like the again with like the gift curse thing, like the structure of language is like actually quite helpful when processing things you don't understand, even if it, can sometimes lead you in the wrong directions with its, assumptions. Um, and for a little bit of like my uni life, it was quite like compulsive. It felt like I was scared of losing things, I think. Losing memories or losing images and so I'd write a lot on my phone. I'd write, just walking home from somewhere, I'd be writing on my phone and just be writing all the time. Like easily the majority of what I've written is, probably from like 2014 to 2019. It's because I was like, for a large amount of that, I was like, I have to write a poem a day, or else I'm not really a writer or something. Um, and um, once finishing Echidna, that changed. Um, because I was like a lot more content with because of the distance of that book, I was a lot more content with what it said about me, essentially. Um, and someone could put themselves in the characters' places in a way that maybe you couldn't with like the narrator, which is clearly just the author. Um, but yeah, I think I don't know. I think habit is exactly it. I just don't know.
Yeah.
Like it just feels like a natural way to process the
I
world,
think
even if it isn't.
I do want to unpack that too, because I think that's actually really important. I feel like a lot of aspiring writers feel like if they haven't published anything, that they're not really writing.
Mm,
Whereas I kind of feel the op almost the inverse now, where it's like if you are writing for yourself because it helps you process what you're going through or anything, that's that's writing. It doesn't need to be
mm,
published for it to be real,
mm,
or for you for or doesn't need to be published for you to be a real writer.
mm,
It's another kind of identity thing, right? Like an identity of like functional role in society or whatever you want to call that.
mm,
Like I don't even know how important it is to call ourselves writers. Like we write,
mm,
and whether you think I'm a writer or not is kind of not actually that relevant in the end. Um, so I really appreciate that you brought up, yeah, the fact that yeah, it's a habit for you and it's important to you because it just helps you deal with stuff.
mm,
Um, and that was how it happened for me as well. Like many angsty teenagers, that was one way to try to channel all those hormones and feelings. And then when I was in the army, it was like we had a lot of spare time in the field, fuck all to do, and it's just like and horrible shit happening all the time. So perfect, perfect combo for writing.
yeah.
Um, And I think a lot of writers who do write a lot probably just have that too. Like it's just that thing of like it's actually quite simple. It's like I need to do this. It's something that helps me deal with stuff, and that's why I do
I
it. And
also feel like
publication is like a
there's
bonus.
I
Yeah.
feel like there's it's an art form with like quite few resistances, at least in my opinion. Like you could just speak into your phone and it's like you doing writing, or you could,
Yeah, but this is
write.
a funny thing to me though. It's both the easiest and like when I talk to people about it, it's like the easiest and the hardest thing. Like you say, it's so easy in the sense that like if I write a message to my friend or my partner or like I'm writing notes on my phone, that's all writing. But somehow when people have the idea, I'm gonna write something,
Mm.
it's like the most difficult, terrifying thing ever.
Well, I feel like that's true in some way, but also I feel like there's a lot of narratives around the difficulty of writing and like the kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of ways in which like people like to make themselves feel special. Like I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of writers talk about it being this thing that they're like good at versus non-writers who aren't good at it. Um, um, and I don't really believe in that because like have you like gone to Christmas and you hear like one of your relatives telling a story and it's like delivered in the most compelling way like possible.
Yeah.
There's also examples where you have no idea what's going on, but but like I don't know. I think storytelling is like part of like why
Yes.
we have language. Like it's how we process things. It's how we communicate with each other. Like a lot of the poems I've written recently are like love poems for friends because
Yeah.
it feels real meaningful to me, um and it's like an act of communication, which I think making poetry or making like written art about communicating with someone can really help because we
Yeah.
already we already use language to do that. I think that's like a really
Yeah.
um
I did actually want to point that out when we were talking about the kind of like leisure writing slash like epistolary
mm,
mode is that I also find that a very, very useful setup
mm,
for writing. And I think it is because of what you say, like we talk language comes so much more naturally when you are simply interacting with someone else,
mm.
as opposed to this feeling like I'm alone and like I need to like sculpt something out of nothing. Um,
Well, it's like one of the things you notice in like, or at least I notice in I was using you and oh god. Anyway, um in things that like have bad dialogue and like no one's telling each other stories about what's going on in their life. It's just
yeah,
like all this very functional like thing that's not how you how you really talk. Or even if it was, it's not interesting to read. Um, which I think is an important part. Um,
because if I can come at this from the point of view of like the kinds of things or conditions or strategies that work to help ease you in or help kind of make people feel like it's not so scary. I think yeah, addressing someone you know is a big one. We also mentioned like referencing other texts,
mm,
or using explicitly other texts in your work, using it to process just simply what's happening for you in your life, like a diary. I
well,
think these are all quite nice entries. Mm.
I feel like that's why like fan fiction's like big for writers who are getting into it. There's also established writers who still just do fan fiction.
Yeah,
I mean,
for
there's also
sure.
also a lot of different ways in which you can frame things as fan fiction, which people might not think of as such. But it's having that like starting point. Like this is the thing I tell students when I tutored creative writing was like your enemy is the blank page, and if you overcome that, then I can help you. But if you don't, then I can't. And I was basically saying like I have no expectations for what you write to be like an amazing thing. But if you write something down, then there's something we can work on. Um, because you can do
Yeah.
so much. You can do so much for something, but you can't really. Yeah, there's like kind of like this a lot of perfectionism in students, and so they even when I told them that they were like, no, it has to be this good thing, and so I got like late
Yeah.
submissions and stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
this to me goes back to what I was trying to highlight earlier when you're talking about Ransack was all the false starts, right? Or I mean, quote unquote false starts, and how
Mm,
important those actually are, and how those are not bugs, at all in your process. Those are features. Like the idea that the thing you write it has to be perfect is so horrible to me.
mm,
Now, looking back. And I do want it to be highlighted that most writing doesn't need to be good. It doesn't even need to be measured at all. And
mm,
if you do find something good, that's awesome, and you can use it, and that's great. But that's kind of almost like a bonus.
mm,
Um, you know, it's almost like a privilege of sorts, I would say.
mm,
And to get there, I argue, you do need to just get shit out. And I know this is hilarious. I was joking with you about this last time, but even if the ratio is like 20 good lines to one good line, that's still fine, you know?
yeah.
Like you'll still get a book pretty quickly, I would say, if you keep going.
Mm.
Um,
No, yeah, like, that's also something I'd say. Just like write a lot of bad shit, but do
yeah,
it all the time. That's like
yeah,
part of why I had that like one poem a day thing. It's just like, wow,
yeah.
I wrote all like garbage, but it got me into like a rhythm or like you know, and yeah, you can
Did
just
you
pick
remember like
the best
NaNoWriMo?
bits. Um,
I never did it, but I like the idea, you know?
yeah, it's getting something out. I never did it, but I do, I do like appreciate the like philosophy behind it.
Yeah, I think it's just speaking to the same core thing, which is like it's trying to demystify the like sacredness of trying to write a book or something, and being like, no, you can make it as mechanical and as basic and as mundane as you want. And you have a book, and it's cool. Like it's
Mm,
special still. Um,
yeah, and that's why I think also like why view editing is so important as well.
yeah,
Like I don't think of there's some things that come out and you're like, cool, that's it. That's the thing. At least from in my experience. But like you can do so much once you've written the thing.
yeah,
You can do like a million things or something. And it could end up being very different to what you expected, but I think that's a really cool part. And a really cool thing to like keep in mind when you're like working on the first draft or something. It's just, this could be something completely different. Um, but it needs to have that first version to get anywhere.
yeah. It's the I think there are 2 points here, which is like you actually, if you I feel like if you loosen up a bit, you'll find that there's always something that you're starting with.
Mm,
There's almost never nothing, and once there is something, that's like you say, all you need to get going. And I think, yeah, like we've just been discussing, there's so many different ways you can summon, something, or like
mm.
steal it from somewhere, or I don't know. Yeah. And the other thing that we touched on earlier that I said we would get back to as well is how important it is to have like community. And I mean that in the broadest sense, it doesn't mean like a huge like national writing community necessarily. It could just be a few friends who care enough to read your work and who witness your
Mm.
life, as a writer. Um, would you talk to me about that again? Because
Well,
obviously
I
these
had
people
a
are important to you.
yeah.
I'm listening. I'm just gonna go check on it.
Hmm. I had as part of a writing group for a very long time. Well, a long time for how long writing groups usually last. Anyway, and that was incredibly important having that like outside of class, quite formal. It'd be weekly, and we'd meet in like a room in the library and share our work and give feedback, and have this quite formal and constructive group. And like setting, I guess. And it was really, yeah, that was like really important for um getting through. I think one of the things is if you're wanting to like publish stuff, rejections are really hard, but they're a lot easier when like, you and three friends have all submitted to the same thing and all been rejected. So you can like commiserate together, or if one of you has been accepted, then you can celebrate on that person's behalf rather than just feeling bad about not having something in the world. Um, which I'm not sure about that instinct, but I also think, at least for me, it's important that um, I don't know, in a general sense, in regards to like the Sakatapu community, at least, it's important to me that work is put in a public space, because so often, um, historically, our voices just not recorded or archived. So like that's one of the things that's important to me. Like I was on a panel with some other writers. I forgot the names of right now. One's not Revila, who's a Hawaiian poet. Um, and we're talking, I was like kind of talking about like the publishing is like archiving, or writing is archiving of a life, um, for you know for the future, um, so that you know, in the hope that people can't just say we didn't happen. I'm sure I'm sure there's some strategies to get around that, but yeah, um, but yeah, having like a group of friends that really care about writing, care about your writing, and you care about theirs is like really, it's really bolstering.
Yeah. I think
Because
even if it was one person,
mm,
that's all you need.
mm,
Yeah. I'm also
yeah,
very grateful for those people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's like a really beautiful thing, and like there's so many things which um are trying to stop you from writing,
Yeah.
um, whether it be, I don't know, commitments in other ways, or just,
Capitalism.
yeah, and and then also just not thinking it's worth it. And I think having other people around who care like really kind of short circuits that thinking, at least for me. um yeah.
Yeah. I definitely agree. I think writing is valuable for anybody. And I think it's a bit of a romanticism, but I'd like to think that at least in the relatively privileged countries and worlds that we're in, everyone can write, everyone does write.
Mm,
And really kind of going back to what you're saying, if you have the capacity to speak at all, you're writing, really.
mm,
Of course, it is different to have something written down on externalized as well. But like I think really what we're trying to reinforce is that anyone, everyone should write, anyone can write. And yeah, I wouldn't let I think there's a particular kind of mythology around writing in Western society, and like it is kind of awful.
mm,
I don't know how much I want to dive into that, but it kind of goes back to some of the stuff that we already addressed, like the idea that a talented writer, is uh like has been like handpicked by God, or has this kind of like special gift, or
mm,
they're struck by the muses and like all this weird stuff that doesn't
mm,
really, it's all about like elevating those who will call themselves writers, um and otherwise just as a form of gatekeeping, like really intense gatekeeping and intimidation.
mm,
um and of course I'm aware that historically, like there was a lot of um there were a lot of other things that prevented people from writing, like various forms of like class warfare and I don't know what else, but yeah.
mm.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
well,
I like to
like,
think there are more people writing now. Mm.
just the suppression of Te Reo Māori, like,
Oh yeah. I mean, when you go to
obviously,
like the erasure of languages and cultures, yeah, that's yeah.
because that's like another thing I'm thinking about, like in terms of, our kind of redefining of writing here as being like something that isn't just the written word, is how in Te Ao Māori, Toi Māori isn't partitioned in such a way as we kind of think, like the visual and the oral, like it's all just kind of coming from the same place because it is about like
These
well,
are
like
like
a lot
ways
of
of
things, but
being,
about
right?
yeah, it's
Yeah. They're
about
ways of
about
becoming, yeah.
relating with the world and pleasure and expression, and also like as a gift to the world as well. Like there's a lot of like I've been reading a lot about like artistic process to like traditional artistic process, which I'm always dubious a lot of these things because a lot of the stuff we have is written by Alston Best or like Governor Gray or these people that we shouldn't trust too much. But just like sometimes the the ways in which the care was put into creating things because we are of the world and the world is like holy essentially, like in terms of like thinking about ngā atua and all that. And it's not, nothing should be done like lightly, and like there's a lot of you see it in like traditional tools, and they're like art pieces at the same time as being a practical thing to use. It's because that there's not this idea of like not wanting to waste things as well, and wanting things to last, but then also wanting things to reflect like the communities they come from, which is like very, very different from the kind of modes of production that we are kind of complicit and embroiled in regards to like a
Yeah.
capitalist society.
Yeah, because there's the notion that like language is kind of simply like some kind of transactional like utility kind of thing. But really like what again, just paraphrasing what you're saying, language language models, they are world to me like disclosive, they're world building things. They're these like I struggle to think of bigger platforms in human technology, really. They're these like
Mm,
massive platforms for how we interact with the world at all. And what codes our, encodes our behaviors and our histories and our traditions and how we see anything.
mm.
Um, yeah, yeah, for sure.
It's like it reminds me of it's an article that's been going around that from Moana Jackson about like freedom of speech essentially. I can't remember the exact um, quote, but it's like in regards to like the tongue being like a spear, um, because like there's this like appreciation of language as being something that can build and destroy community, and community, in a in a pre-capitalist society is like kind of everything.
Yeah,
Um, and so that that the idea of like the different perspective of speech and then what that means to like what we're doing with language is like hugely different. Yeah, not really sure how that ties back in, but I think I don't know. It's something, at least for me, about like the responsibility.
yeah,
Um, there's like a lot of stuff where, and I've also been guilty of this, like the downplaying of like, it's just poetry that no one reads, or whatever. But
I
I
think to me
think,
you're getting almost to the notion of like this kind of degree of responsibility. I think that you're implying here is a form of stewardship, really.
yeah, and like it's actually quite important. Like it, like it might not seem it, but like there were poets who lived their whole lives not publishing anything, and then they're like, well-known names now. Wow, well-known amongst poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins or someone like that. Just didn't have. I don't know. I think it's maybe a combination of cynicism and naivete that you think what you're doing isn't important because like someone could find your work long after you're dead and get something um quite rewarding out of it, which is like why I think which is why like having books published was important to me, I guess. Yeah, I feel less compelled to get things published. Like if people email me and like offer to commission something or something, then I'll do that. But otherwise, I'm not on that like kind of hamster wheel, submit to all the journals kind of space that I was for a few years. Um, yeah, feels a bit.
Maybe we could talk a
Uh,
bit about that. I mean, that's kind of more, I think what it feels like to feel a bit more, like you were saying earlier, like secure in your function, your role, like
mm,
what it is that you see yourself contributing, now that you have published a couple of books. So I think we're in a similar place in that sense. Like I don't, and I don't know, sometimes I wonder, like, is that because I've seen enough and experienced enough that I know what's important to me? Or is it because I'm privileged enough that I already
mm,
have things out there? So I don't feel that same sense of urgency and immediacy as I did when I was younger. I'm sure it's both, and not suggesting that we have an answer for that either, but
well, like there's like some security, like you have, um, like the short of some fascist like tactics, right? Like your book's just going to be in the world for a while. Um, and
I mean, do you think
um,
about Voldemort and like the diary? Like the shards, Like do you think about it?
I
I think about it all the time.
was really not expecting to hear Voldemort brought up in this conversation. I don't know what. Uh,
That
um,
was a bit of a joke, but like it kind of, like if you took the most charitable lens on his strategy, it was about him persisting, right? In through his
yeah, yeah,
writing.
yeah, yeah. And his
Uh,
like weird anagram name thing that he does.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, strategy used to unfortunate ends, perhaps, like in his context, but like, recognizable from a certain perspective. But it
Yeah,
also comes back, why I like it comes back to the mininess thing to me and like what resilience is and how things persist through time. And like, if you've like split yourself into all these parallel parts, then, the chances of something of yours persisting is stronger, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, Another bizarre question that is like really just now, I think, getting to the lighter end of things, like you're talking about, have you thought about like carving something in stone? I mean, it's the most pretentious, most kind of like, uh, I don't know what kind of person you'd have to be really to be like, I'm gonna carve something into like a stone tablet in 2023 or whatever, so that it will last for like 1,000 years. But it's funny though, right? It's pretty funny. Like I think there was this thing, it was like where is it? It's somewhere in Scandinavia, if I'm not wrong. It's a nuclear waste like
yeah.
containment site, and they had to deal with this problem of like warning people away into like the distant future. And
Mm,
for a language problem, I thought that was kind of fucking amazing. Um, where they had to think, okay, we may not be able to use written languages, or okay, if we do, we need to accompany it with symbols. For what kinds of symbols can persist and like still be recognized in like 10,000 years or something, 20,000 years. And um, Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked to a friend about this quite a lot actually, and like the idea of different cultures and different cultures having different symbols that persist
Yeah.
in ways that like might not necessarily happen for the English language essentially. And it was just like this
Mm.
kind of like I don't know, yeah, just really exploring the like, kind of maybe futility of how signal don't don't open this to someone 1,000 years from now. Um, yeah, but then also different like modes you can take, and then also just the kind of I guess cultural criticism of it being assuming so much, even in the context of just like a culture today versus another culture today. Um,
Yep.
yeah, and like
Yep.
that kind of assumption that our perspectives are like general when they're really specific.
Exactly.
Especially when you have like the hegemonic perspective, you're like, oh, this is how everyone sees the world. You're like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a false, it's kind of like an illusion of like totality or like this kind of like
Mm,
yeah, untouchable totality. Yeah. Especially under, under capitalism. And like, it can feel like we've like run out of possibilities or something, which is kind of messed up. But definitely not something I believe either.
well, it's like the
Um,
was it the end of history that
yeah,
old
yeah, yeah, that old thing.
idea.
Yeah, and I think that's why it always makes sense for me to go back to language because again, language is what is, can I don't know, destroy and create our world. So,
Mm.
make
Yeah,
new
well,
or
I think
or entrench. Yeah.
like something I think about in regards to I think I thought about it a lot more recently in regards to like David Seymour had like a go at Tusiata Via over one of her poems about well, she wrote a poem about Captain Cook essentially,
Hmm.
and he was like, "That's racist." It's okay. Um, but I was just thinking about like the contrast or similarities between poetry and policy, and how we talk about words not doing much, but like they do they do everything. Like
Yeah.
policy is words enforced by violence, essentially. Um, so I don't know. I was just thinking about like Seymour's relationship to words and power when you know, like I
Yeah.
guess it's not in Parliament, but
I mean, I do totally think of like legislation as society level like computation, right? Or like society
mm,
level like algorithmic structures, basically
yeah,
that govern bodies and behaviors and whatnot. Um,
mm, yeah. So it's actually one of the like first ideas I had when I was thinking about doing a PhD, and it's just like, oh, this is too, this is too much. Thinking about policy as poetry. Like
I
I
mean,
don't have I don't have a lawyer's education, so
in
I
my
don't
brief
understand what they're
time,
saying anyway.
my brief time studying law, I dropped out after the second year, or during the second year. I That was one of the cool aspects, like the cooler aspects of law that I got to learn about. Thankfully, amazingly, some of it is being taught. Like the idea uh, that these things are constructed and that they change and that they're quite arbitrary and that they're loaded with like historical baggage and weird biases. And
Mm.
I was like, oh,
That's
cool. That was
that's
actually
like
a cool part of
like
law.
that's like why court precedents are so important in regards
Yeah.
to like law, right? Because you're
Yes.
like, here is how someone interpret this, so I can also interpret it the same way. Um, I remember I was signing something. I can't remember what. It was some legal document, and it used a mixture of we slash I throughout the
Interesting.
document. And I was just
Fascinating.
like thinking
Hmm.
about everyone who complains about like they them pronouns. And I was just like, read this. This is deranged, and like it falls apart because like we and I don't necessarily do the same the same function in a sentence. And I was just like reading this, just being like, I had to read the sentence like 3 times, and I'm like, this is a legal document. I guess I should be
I
thankful
think
it's not in French or Latin, right?
it's true. Well, I think that it's funny, like the philosophy of language and all that. I think we could probably have a whole other session on that. It's in and of itself, you know.
Mm,
Um, so kind of zooming out a bit more and maybe looking towards wrapping this up. I
mm,
think what we've just come out of was we talked about like what it's like to actually live and write and
mm,
have a writing life, and then we had a I think quite a cool like discussion about language in general, like its higher functions, like what it's done, various tensions within it, various contexts in which like it is scarily fundamental. Um, was there anything else about, I don't know, your practice, your writing life that you wanted to address or talk about?
So I wrote most of Echidna on a typewriter before moving it to a Word document, and I use like a kind of the headings so you can separate them in like the search function on Word, and you can move them around. Um, I don't know. I just want to talk about that because like that's like I go to my study and physically sit at my desk and actually type things onto a computer, and sometimes like the things I think sometimes it's really helpful for me to have like someone on a call or someone just sitting near me or sitting
Mm,
in the other room, for me to like actually focus on writing as well.
fascinating.
And having water near me at all times is important. Um,
Yeah, let's get into some
and
of these rituals, like music.
I so it depends. Um, for a lot of my study life, I have to listen to music or else I can't focus. Um, and that music tends to be many notes per second. um, just because there's just like no space. Like I need it to like kind of focus me. But like for creative writing, it's not always needed. Like once I get that image, I'm pretty like the first line or the first image or whatever. I'm just pretty uh set until run out of steam or
I think,
want to do
yeah,
something
and
else.
I think how I would paraphrase that is that for you, it's what's important to consider maybe as some of those like initial starting conditions.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not being too hot. I hate I hate being too hot. I just can't think, which is maybe unlucky because global warming. Not that not that that necessarily means it'd be warmer year round.
Well,
Anyway.
I always find it, going, I remember we talked about this earlier, like whether you had some of those important books like right near you when you were
Mm,
writing. And I think that for me personally is a big thing. Like being able to just like turn and flip through someone's work who
mm,
who's that's really important to me, is like endlessly helpful for me.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, like all my poetry is just up there and
yeah,
there, and yeah, it's all very like within arm's reach if I want to respond to something or have an idea of a poem that's like speaking to some other
yeah.
work, or like want to
Get
try
into a
like
vibe.
yeah. So yeah. Um, but yeah, also just sitting on the grass with the typewriter, I think has been a quite nice experience. I wrote a couple of Echidna poems like that just because it's just so tactile. Yeah.
My cat's just come to say hi. I had a thought. What was it? I think for me, the other thing that's sometimes helpful if I'm really stuck starting is actually just pulling up old work. Kind of,
Mm,
again, going back to that topic of like recycling stuff.
mm,
I think that's another strategy that I use sometimes, or tactic, I should say, is like, okay, I'm sure I've got lots of leftover bits that I are not fully digested and that would still be like
mm.
fun to go and like ruminate on again. Um,
Yeah, well, like one thing I found really fun is just continuing to write poems that are published
yeah.
and just going
Yes,
and
yes, yes. I haven't done
like
that much, but
evolving them
yes.
some more. I think that's like quite interesting, being like, oh,
Well,
because
actually, I have gone back and found like lines that I think like aren't done yet.
mm,
Then I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, you were good here, but I think that you can have another life over here.
mm, I think that's really, yeah, something good about just going back through and you can like one thing that's cool that I don't do often, but just taking the last line of a poem you wrote ages ago and making that the first line for whatever you know whatever you want to do now. And you might not even keep that line in the poem, but like it gets you started. And I think that's like the hardest part.
There was one more thing that I do want to ask you about in this realm of like little rituals or like tactics.
Mm,
And something that I think I kind of knew for a long time, but I still struggled to actually um repeat is actually just sitting and like not doing anything. Whether
mm,
it's because you've chosen to do that or that you've been forced to do that. I don't know about you, but airports, my brain just goes off. And then if I'm on the plane, sometimes like I like have to write stuff because this the
mm.
churn is going so hard.
Right.
Um, and do you find this like do you try to stop yourself from like I don't know scrolling on the internet like to make sure you have some like meditative like daydream time whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I've been trying to do that more lately. We have chickens, so I just go out in the backyard
Yeah,
and just sit with them.
yeah,
Um, I've been listening to like a lot of records, and it feels very like a purposeful way to listen to music versus like streaming and all that, which is like you have to get up halfway through the album and flip it, and then
yes.
so I've had
Mm,
moments where I had times recently where I just all I'm doing is just listening to music, which isn't usually how I how I would consume music would be like while doing a million other things. And so yeah, I found that really like especially for the PhD work, it's incredibly valuable because you need to give your brain a break, and like so many of the things that kind of consume my everyday do not, like especially like scrolling social media. That's like takes up so much brain space, that kind of stuff.
yeah, and your brain needs space to just play as well and
Mm,
like go for a wander and um if you're a particularly like anxious or neurotic person like I am, it's hard sometimes to allow that to actually happen.
mm,
Because you're scared of
yeah.
what your brain is going to do or where it's going to take you.
Mm,
But I think it's very, very important, and it's like almost a form of like self-care as well, you know.
mm,
But yeah, I think that's a big one that um, yeah, for me it's still like a an ongoing project really,
mm,
and do that consistently. But I think good tips to be like your little chores, your little errands around the house, that those are
mm,
good windows for that. Doing the dishes, like yeah, hanging out with your chickens, hanging out with your plants, your pets. Um, all of those moments are good. Um, not that we have to like, go and like mine every free moment for writing or anything, but
no, no,
often
but
it
you
just
do need
comes
to you
just
do need to take a break.
You do need to take a break.
Um,
Yeah.
mm.
Well, yeah, I think this was a pretty cool conversation. I'm really, really pleased with like what we got to talk about.
Mhm.
Um, have you had a nice time?
Yeah, it's been good. I was actually just like wondering if I could talk about what I'm working on at the moment.
I did actually want to ask you about that too. Yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
Um, I was like really resonated with the false starts thing because I think I'm in the middle of that. Or because in my head I want there to be three poetry books that relate to each other in some way, like hint, like so.
Love triads.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm not sure. Yeah, the poetry collection at the moment is in like the full start stage. I had this idea of writing about um like computer technology as Papatūānuku, because like it literally is, it's from the ground. Um, and then I just got stuck because like a lot of where I was in regards to certain things changed very quickly. Um, and then I like changed the idea again, and now I'm thinking of doing something else, but but I'm not sure about. Um, but yeah, it's I think going to be like kind of the creative part of my thesis. Um, yeah, which is looking at like representations of Atua in poetry by queer Māori. Um,
Rad, super cool.
um, yeah, and so it's going to have something to do with that. And I've been experimenting with using um, uh, an alphabet that Mahi Whakataka Brightwell made in the 80s, which was kind of like it's supposed to be like a learning tool for children for te reo Māori. Because like one of the difficult things when you're starting to learn to pronounce Māori words is that you think that they're written with English characters, and they're not really. They just happen to look the same.
Mhm.
And that's like actually quite a difficult. Like it's why a lot of people suck at pronunciation.
Yeah,
They're like, oh,
yeah,
that I know that letter, and it's like you don't actually.
yeah,
Um, you
yeah.
know. And so he made this alphabet that didn't really get any people didn't really take it up, but I thought it was like really interesting and a lot easier than other attempts to make into a font, essentially. Um, because it's just like kind of one to one, and it's not like trying to do something that's outside of like the kind of English constructions or whatever, and how like script works. There are some really cool stuff people have been doing where it like makes it more like pictographic. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you even start to like make that. Um, Probably have to like custom program a lot of things. But anyway, I was able to make a font
Hey, hit me
out of
up if
this.
you any programmingness.
Yeah.
Not that I could necessarily do everything that you need, but like feel
Mm.
free to hit me up.
Oh, well, yeah, it might be an interesting conversation to have anyway. Um, but yeah, I've been using this like font um when using Te Reo Māori words in the poems. Um, so that it's like I don't know. I feel
I
like
like
there's
that
like this
tactic.
kind of conversation about who, especially in regards to like the revitalization of the language and how open the schools are to just teaching anyone who will apply, which is I guess to accommodate like anti-discrimination or whatever.
Well, it
Um,
brings to mind one thing for me, which is actually Alistair Punga Somerville's
mm,
uh last book,
mm,
which is also looking at it on a glyph level, right? Like it's about marks
mm,
and markedness. And I think that's quite I'd never thought about, using a different font, as opposed to being like, oh, should it be italicized or, like,
yeah, the use of italics in that book is so like the first time I read one of those poems was such like a powerful um like encounter, I guess.
Yeah.
Because it was like, oh yeah, like the language that we spend most of our time speaking comes from elsewhere. Um, it's just like such a simple but really,
Yeah.
really like well executed inversion of the
Yes.
like italicization in you know literature and all that. But yeah, like the idea was to kind of take the language back in a way, like to make it incomprehensible in
Yes.
some ways. And like I do wonder where I'll end up with it because as like uh a product for someone to buy and consume. I think at the moment it's pretty uh hostile in design. But I'm really enjoying, because Echidna was like, I'm gonna sit and tell you a story. Like it's me being a storyteller for a book. And I really want to push out a kind of more going back to maybe Ransack's thing of like, you think language is actually intelligible?
Yeah.
um, you know, like we're not intelligible as identities, as entities. So
Well,
yeah, I'm trying to push back into that space because I'm finding, I don't know, just the contrast, I guess, is exciting to me. Like doing something completely different again.
at the risk of just maybe again paraphrasing something else that we've said already, but I do think it's always important to look at how you can use language to escape capture,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, to escape reduction. How you can use language to be um, subversive in its opacity,
Mm-hmm.
in its ability to not be able to be counted as one, or something that you just can't easily draw a line around and you know leave behind. Um, so very interested in this project, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm curious, whether, how would I put it? Yeah, in the context of false starts, like I'm so curious to see how this whole project evolves.
Mm-hmm.
And false start or not, I imagine this is gonna play a role. That's
Mm-hmm.
always the cool thing about false starts. I feel like they
Yeah,
often do end up playing roles anyway.
there's like things you can borrow from what you've tried to do. Yeah.
I also
Um,
like the idea, by the way, that you're like maybe feeling a bit more indignant again, not feeling like such a nice, polite storyteller, and wanting to just be like, you're gonna deal with this or you're not, and it's kind of it. I like that.
yeah, well, that's like, I don't know. I don't really want to bring this up, but just like the kind of had that like one kind of transphobic response to Echidna,
Mm.
where they were like took issue with like they them pronouns, and I'm like, I'm not even in the book. Echidna uses she her
Sad.
pronouns. I was like, I tried to make this palatable. It was just really, yeah. It was like the exact response I expected for Ransack, but like he ended up coming later for a
Fuck
completely
them.
different book. Yeah. Ugh. But no, I'm excited about, yeah, taking my time and just exploring what the next book will be.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
super excited. Excited to hear like, more as the process unfolds, and of course, like whatever you do end up having as the output,
Mm,
nominally.
mm,
Um, Super cool. Um, that might be us.
mm. Yeah.
That might be us. Thank you so much. And I mean, like I think there are like 100 conversations in that one conversation there, and
Mm,
I could easily see us revisiting some of them.
mm,
So yeah, I reckon we stay tuned. Um, Otherwise, thank you so much. Um, I'll end the call and the recording here.
mhm.
And yeah, hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you again real soon.